Start? All right, I'll start. Well, good afternoon now. My name is Donald Bryson. I'm president here at the John Locke Foundation, and thanks for coming to the latest presentation of the Civitas poll. We are obviously tracking things going on in North Carolina very heavily. We do 8 to 10 of these polls every year, but things happen in even-numbered years. It's crazy, and so typically what we do in those even-numbered years is we poll August, September, October, and November. Of course, the November poll is what in the world just happened to us, and we'll get there. But you are in the September edition of what this is the next to last poll before Election Day. And of course, some ballots have already been cast. If you want to do that, we actually track early voting through a website that we maintain called CarolinaElections.com. You can click that and check the vote tracker. I checked it, day before yesterday, and it's something like 6,800 mail-in ballots that have already been turned in. I don't know what it is today. But they're still coming in. You can see where they're coming from, what the demographics are, and all that. And it's a neat thing to track in addition to what we do here with our polling. As always, we have a guest commentator today, or with every poll. But this month's guest commentator is Donna King. She's editor-in-chief with Carolina Journal. She's one of the smartest people I know, and hopefully she'll say a lot smarter things than I will today. And so we're really glad to have you here. If you want to follow her on Twitter, she's at Donna King CJ. Is that right? Look at there, off the top of my head.
You got it.
I got it. So let's go ahead and dig into the poll. Let's start talking, and we'll get some questions. We'll take questions at the end. We might have questions online. There are people we live stream this on Facebook and YouTube. If people want to send in their questions, those are two venues. Then, of course, we have people here in the media room with us, and we'll take questions from you all as well. Our latest edition of the poll, as has been for the past 5 years, was conducted by Signal. This was in the field September 24th through the 26th, so over this past weekend. It actually went in the field the day that Ted Budd held his rally in Wilmington with Donald Trump, so just keep that in mind. That we didn't ask about that specifically, but just keep that in mind that that's what was going on when it was in the field. There were a sample size of 650 likely North Carolina voters. Not that they're likely in North Carolina, but they're in North Carolina and likely to vote and self-identified that way. That gives us a margin of error of 3.79% plus or minus. We conduct this poll with a blended method, and we do it through live phone interviews, texts, as well as email invitation. We have a 95% confidence interval with all of our polls. That means if we conducted this poll 20 times, 19 out of those 20 times we'd fall within that 3.79% margin of error. We feel pretty good about our poll. All right, you ready?
Absolutely,
Here we
let's
go. Let's talk about the electoral environment in North Carolina. One question that we've started over the past couple of months is asking, how are you going to vote this year? This is an interesting question because things sort of got flipped on their head in 2020, and an unprecedented number of people voted by mail. We can see this is a slight uptick. Last month, that absentee by mail was at 7.8%. It's up just a little bit. You can see 48.9% in-person, 42.8% early in-person, then 48.9% in-person on Election Day. These two combined mean that a majority of votes will be cast before Election Day this year, if this holds to be true. Donna, any thoughts on this one?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that I've noticed and I always look for is Republicans tend to vote on Election Day. I think I'm one of those. I like to go, participate in the process and show up on Election Day. There are fewer of us now that make that choice. One of the things I was looking at was this younger crowd, this 18 to 34. They're more likely to be voting ahead. So as we move forward, as they become older and older voters, that's something to be keeping in mind, that they are probably going to keep that pattern. And that's true across the area. So, urban is much less likely to go and vote in person, probably because of lines or concern about lines, things like that, which means that for the urban voters who tend to be voting more Democrat, they're going to be getting theirs in early, so those numbers are going to spike for Democrats.
Yeah, traditionally in North Carolina, the predominant demographic that voted early by mail was this 65-plus crowd, right? It's just easier, right? They don't have to find out, they don't have to drive, they don't have to figure out their transportation and all that. But look at this, and by the way, all of our crosstabs and the top lines are all available for all of our polls. If you want to go to johnlocke.org, you can click on the tabs. We provide all of this information. But this 18 to 34-year-olds, 25% say they're going to vote absentee by mail. The next up, 35 to 49s are 5%, 4%, 50 to 64-year-olds, I mean, nobody comes even in double digits except for the 18 to 30.
And some of that might be that they are not living where their ballot might show up, where they would normally cast. They may, it may be college students, maybe young adults, that their information is still going to their parents' house. But the fact that they're engaged and they plan to do it is something we just watch as they get older.
All right. We ask people, generally speaking, would you say things in the United States are headed in the right direction or off on the wrong track? People have been very pessimistic for a couple of years now on the poll. And it was interesting after the 2020 election that split on a partisan basis, but still a majority of people are pessimistic. 66.3% say wrong track, 24% say right direction. I mean, as you would sort of expect, you see that, Democrats and well, actually, liberals are kind of split, but Democrats are actually more optimistic than they are pessimistic, about 10%. And then if you look at Republicans, I mean, 94% say wrong track.
Sure, sure. And, even moderates, moderates who you would think would be affected most, perhaps focusing on inflation and that kind of thing, they are right directions, only 38%. But if you look over at those who voted for Trump and Biden in 2020, it's pretty clear that the Trump supporters are 96%, wrong track, and the Biden supporters not quite as committed at right at 49%.
They are not. All right. We do generic ballot tests. Obviously, this is a statewide poll, and this is an important explanation. I make it every month, but it's still important. It's a statewide poll, but there are 170 state legislative districts, and then there are 14 congressional districts. We're not going to poll each one of those. We wouldn't have a big enough sample size in those polls to give you a good indication of what was going on in those districts. But generally speaking, we do what is called a generic ballot test. If you're going to vote for Congress or state legislature today, you're going to vote Republican or you're going to vote Democrat. I know I'm going to have some Libertarians and Green Party people who are upset that we didn't include Libertarians or Green Parties in this sample. The thing is, there aren't Green Party or Libertarian candidates in every legislative or congressional race. And so if they want to say unsure someone else, they have that option. On the generic ballot test for state legislature, Republicans are up 2%, 42%, 46.6 to 44.5%. That's still good for Republicans. That is not the norm for Republicans to be up in generic ballot test, even going back to the 2010 elections on the Civitas poll. Nonetheless, this lead was 5% last month, and it was 11% back in June, so it's getting smaller.
And actually, I do think it's interesting that if, we'll talk about this later when we start getting into the Senate race, this is a higher performance for Republicans than what we'll see in the Senate race in just a few minutes. That may indicate that the state legislature could outperform some of the other folks that are higher up on the ballot.
You'll see similar results for Congress. It's a generic ballot test for Congress. Republicans at 47.5%, Democrats at 44.2%, a little better than where Republicans were in the ballot test for state legislature, but still within the margin of error and still a tick down. However, notes here, they're tied in the suburbs. College-educated men and non-college-educated women are leaning Republican.
I think the number of people who are unsure is kind of surprised me. It seems like by now people would be more decided, more clear on what they're going to do. So that really could make a huge difference when they show up, because if you remember the slide before, most of those unaffiliated in the high 40s said that they were going to vote in person. So some of those undecided and unaffiliated folks, they're going to really make a difference on Election Day.
Yeah. All right. Here's the one you all really want to know about. It's the U.S. Senate race. Last month, Ted Budd and Sherry Beasley were tied at 42.3% apiece exactly. This month, they're still statistically tied. Remember, our margin of error is 3.79%. Sherry Beasley is up to a 0.3% lead. That's a tie. Any pollster is going to tell you that that is a tie. So it's still really close. Matthew Hoh with the Green Party getting less than 1%, Shannon Bray getting 1.3%. Both of those don't even reach the margin of error. This undecided number at 10.3% is interesting. Since we started polling this race back in May after the primary, that undecided number has swung between 10.3%, which is the lowest that it's been, and 12%. There is still a lot of play for these two between Ted Budd and Sherry Beasley to figure out what's going to happen with these undecided people here.
Right, that's a big one. But we really do have, this could make the difference. That Green Party and Libertarian, as small as it is, it really could ultimately make the difference. I was looking at this suburban, how close they are in suburban areas versus urban, coastal, and rural, but of course doing a little better than Beasley in these coastal rural areas, which I think is not a huge surprise, particularly when they had the Save America rally out in Wilmington and the farm and all those kind of things. Right. He's going to perform better in those places. But moderate people who identify as moderate for Ted Budd are only 22%, which to me means that this message that the Democrats are using, labeling him, using the word extremist, and really trying to pull in some of those emotions is working. To me, those unaffiliated, moderate voters are hearing that extremist message, and it's effective for Beasley.
Yeah, it is effective for Beasley. She took a risk, and it is paying off dividends that they wanted to spend a lot of money really early, and they spent a lot of money in the summer. One, to go ahead and get her name ID up and out there, and two, to convince national Democrat groups, including the DNC itself, that she shouldn't be on the cut list if things were starting to go poorly, to show that she was a viable candidate. She's very clearly a viable candidate, and things are going on. I don't know what to make of what's going on with the Ted Budd campaign since he jumped out to what should have been a big lead. You see he's at 43.7% here. But on the generic ballot test for Congress, it's at 47%. He's consistently run 4 to 5 points behind the generic congressional Republican. He is a congressional Republican. So what is it about Ted Budd that makes him run behind what people generally think about when they think about a Republican candidate?
Well, some of that is the strategy, right?
Right.
So Ted Budd's strategy, their campaign strategy, they did a 100-county tour over the last, several months, and really focused on building up that rural, coastal, non-urban places where they're not going to really make any headway in the urban areas, and they've stayed there. So I think the numbers reflect that choice that they're making, but it does mean that there maybe isn't that widespread favorability or recognition for his candidacy.
There's not, and this is the question for me, and I don't want to linger on this question too long because I'm sure we'll come back to it. But if I'm a, boots on the ground Republican activist, and I'm not endorsed for Ted Budd or the Republican Party or Wake County GOP or whatever, my question, I asked this last month and I'll continue to ask it, is where's Club for Growth? They dropped $12 million on the primary. They clearly dominated the Republican primary for U.S. Senate, right? And I'm not saying Ted Budd's a bad candidate. This is not a judgment about Ted Budd. This is a question about strategy and getting a Republican elected. Where is Club for Growth now? Because I have to believe that if you're a conservative organization, that the qualitative difference between Ted Budd and Sherry Beasley is much broader than it is between Ted Budd and Pat McCrory or Marjorie Eastman, right? So why drop $12 million on people that there's not a huge distinction between compared to this race? I don't know where they are.
Interesting.
All right. There are state Supreme Court races going on. There are 2 of them this year. 2 of our 7 are up. The first one is Richard Dietz against Lucy Inman. Richard Dietz has maintained about a 4 to 5% lead here. He's at 44.5%, 40.5% with Lucy Inman. I heard she has a TV ad up. Was it? Yeah, it was Mitch that was telling me she has a TV ad up. I haven't seen it, but something about wearing a lot of hats. Right. You can see the... look at the female to male difference here. If you see that, Inman, there is a gender gap here. 46% of females saying they're going to vote for Lucy Inman, 34% saying they're going to, or of males saying they're going to vote for Lucy Inman. So there's a clear gender gap here.
Sure. So one of the things that I think is interesting about this is, so we, several of us, I think, in here attended the Federalist Society panel where all 4 candidates stood up with John Hood and talked a little bit about their judicial philosophy and their background and that kind of thing. One of the things that really struck me is that I didn't know much about these candidates. I kind of knew a little bit of their professional background, but I think a lot of folks perhaps in North Carolina don't. So Dietz, they're both currently on the Court of Appeals. Dietz is sort of a, bootstraps, comes from a working class family, went to Wake Forest, went to Duke. He is a, bookish, intellectual type guy. Lucy Inman, also on the Court of Appeals, comes from the Daniels family, Josephus Daniels family, that started the News and Observer. So she is part of North Carolina's Democrat legacy. Like, she has been a part of the Democratic Party. Her family has for multiple generations. Dietz is sort of a, relative. He's on the Court of Appeals, certainly, and a newcomer bootstraps kind of candidate. And I think that may appeal to a lot of Republicans once they know more about him. And you'll see that as similar in the other race as well.
It is. We do have another state Supreme Court race up. Sorry. I wanted to show the trend lines about how this has gone. You can see starting back in May, Dietz has maintained a lead. It was, just 3.3 points within the margin of error there, but then he jumped out to a much larger lead once we got into June, and it's mediated just a little bit, but he's still, that's a healthy lead. You should probably feel good about it if you're a candidate with a 4% lead in a state like North Carolina going into October.
I think it's interesting that he's outperforming Inman, because the Supreme Court race is critically important, and I think most really engaged voters know how important these races are. If Republicans flip just one, it switches from a Democrat-leaning court to a Republican-leaning court.
Right.
So the fact that he's outperforming Lucy Inman, it seems pretty significant when you compare it to, say, the Bud race or even the generic ballot to some degree.
Right.
Can I ask a question?
Sure. Sure.
So how do you track how many people don't vote for judges? Because they don't know who to vote for. Do you track? They vote for a Republican candidate. Ted Budd's going to be all over the screen, but the judges typically.
That's a really, really important question. That sort of ballot roll. I think ballot roll off.
It is ballot roll off. It's the idea that people vote for president, they vote for U.S. Senate, and then they just sort of stop voting. That was a much larger problem. Were not partisan labels on the judicial races. Back in the early 2000s, when Democrats were still controlling the General Assembly, they took the partisan labels off of judicial races, and then immediately, you want to talk about disenfranchising voters, you're talking about 17, 18, 20, 21% of people just didn't vote for judicial races, because how do you know the difference, right? One, if you're a judicial candidate, how do you go out and raise millions of dollars?
Sure.
It's almost impossible, right? Because you can't guarantee you're going to make a decision on this case or that case. Like, this is my general judicial philosophy. Wow, I'm a donor. That sounds really great. Let's give $1 million to a PAC. It doesn't happen, right? But a partisan label gives people a general idea of what happens. Ballot roll-off went down even more significantly in 2020 for reasons we're still trying to figure out. And so for state Supreme Court, you're talking about ballot roll-off in counties at 2 to 4%, whereas 10 years ago we were seeing 15% as a norm. So it's improving, but there is a point where people stop voting for judges. In the other race, it's Democrat and incumbent Sam Ervin running against Republican Trey Allen. Allen has a larger lead than Dietz does here. And my understanding is that Allen has actually raised a little bit more money and might be more aggressive right now. He has about a 7.1% lead outside of the margin error. 15% of people still undecided.
Sure. Now, nationally, Democrats are pretty highly invested in these two races, and I think it maybe early on they, saw, a problem that they may be having at the national level and started focusing a little bit on these judicial races like this. At one point, Inman and Ervin were outraising the Republicans 5-1. That gap is closing a bit. But again, about these candidates' backgrounds is really interesting. So Trey Allen, former Marine, clerked for Paul Newby. He has a pretty strong Republican conservative background, an original constitutionalist. Sam Ervin has, again, just like Inman, has a legacy in the Democratic Party in North Carolina. His grandfather was a senator. His father was on the Court of Appeals. We saw him mention that often in that Federalist Society event. He really focused on his family background in North Carolina Democratic politics. Trey Allen, though, he seems like a little bit more of a elbow thrower type and a Marine, and I think that's resonating with people, particularly donors, actually.
It is, and again, turned it off. I want to make note, we were like a NASCAR team over here, switched out mics, she kept talking, didn't even notice. We are the home of NASCAR, right? We do it with mics as well. But notice the gap here on females, 44 to 40%. It was much more stark, 46% for Inman, 38%. People, I don't want to simplify it down to this, but there's something to be said for women are voting when they see a woman's name, and they're not doing it as much when they don't see a woman's name.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's absolutely a point. I think there's not enough women on the ballot across the ballot, and that will definitely benefit her among women. And also, we got to talk a little bit about the Dobbs decision. That's really, Democrats are focusing on that, and they're using it to mobilize their base and draw attention to people who may drop off the ballot, may not vote down ballot. They're drawing attention from Democrats based on that decision, saying that we need to be focused on this because the abortion issue will eventually end up before the North Carolina Supreme Court. So they're really using it to mobilize their base the way Republicans are using inflation.
Right. If you're not talking about Dobbs or inflation, you're wasting your time.
Right.
I mean, that's just, unless you're an urban candidate talking about crime, then that might be the exception. And again, I mean, you can see the Dobbs decision came about right here, and there was a dip from where Allen was. I mean, he's still, I mean, 7 points isn't anything to sniff at, right? But you can definitely see this dip that happened over the summer from our June poll to our August poll. All right. We asked people what their interest was in voting. They self-identified as likely to vote, but like how enthusiastic are you about voting? The pollster came back to me with, we're going to ask this on a scale of 1 to 7. And I was like, well, you're going to have to explain to me why 1 to 7 and not 1 to 5 or 1 to 10. He said, well, we found that odd numbers make people more honest about it, because typically they're just going to say 10 or 5 and be done with it. But with odd numbers and a 7-point scale, we find a bit more disparity there. So here we are. Still 69% say at 7%, but Republicans, this is the thing here. Republicans are 5% more likely to say 7 than Democrats are, which means that there is a slight enthusiasm gap.
Well, I mean, I think that makes sense, actually, from what we're seeing in the economy and gas prices. All of these things are hitting everybody equally, regardless of party. Going back to what you were talking about, methodology, we had a great opportunity in Carolina Journal. If you get a chance, go back and look at carolinajournal.com with an interview with the pollster that works on this. And he said that one of the key things that we saw in 2020, 2016, where there were problems with polls underestimating Republicans, that they've tried to, one of the biggest problems is not getting enough outlets. They use text message, they use online, they use landlines, cell phones, and because some people still live, like it's 1998, and they're willing to pick up the phone on the wall and answer a poll. But others are straight text or Facebook or whatever. So getting lots of different ways to reach people is one way. They've tried to close that gap and get a more accurate poll, because that was a big lesson that they learned in 2020. But he also said there's something called a favorability bias, that there has become a social stigma around supporting Trump or Trump's endorsed candidates. And he said that they have to, factor that in too. Right.
There was the, what do they call it? The whisper interviews. People would whisper that they favored Donald Trump, but they didn't want to say it out loud, like in front of their family or whoever was over at the time. Right, but that's what this enthusiasm is. You see that they are probably more likely to show up regardless of how they answer the poll. Right. All right. We ask on job approval. Did you approve or disapprove? Do you approve or disapprove of the job that Joe Biden is doing as president? He has been underwater, continues to be underwater. It's a slight improvement for him this month. We had him down 17 points last month, 16 points this month. I mean, 55% of people are starting off saying that they don't like the job that he's doing. That's a very large plurality saying that they have high disapproval at 47.9%, 39.3%. Approve. That is probably just a little bit higher than just a rock solid Democrat base. I would say, a solid Democrat base, they're going to vote for anybody who has a D after their name, is probably closer to like 32, 34%. So just a little uptick from that. He's underwater here, though. Sure. I thought it would be wider, actually. When we talked about polling this, you're seeing he's in the 30s with every group except for 65 and over, and he's 46. Right. So I thought it would be a little wider, but what that does mean is that the messaging that Democrats have out there is working. I think that having MSNBC and CNN and some of those groups somewhat in their camps has been effective. But then we do have things like Sherry Beasley just can't seem to get her schedule right to be with the president. Right. And again,
how
that works out.
Again, strategy. I mean, understanding who your audience is.
Right, and you have 55% of unaffiliated voters disapprove. The difference between Republicans and Democrats is always interesting to look at. 80% of Democrats approve, 94% of Democrats disapprove. Again, there's an enthusiasm gap there as they're looking into this year's elections. All right. Do you approve or disapprove of the job that Roy Cooper is doing as governor? He is viewed entirely differently from Joe Biden. There is no connection between those two. I think a couple of months ago at a poll presentation, I called him Teflon Roy because nothing sticks to him. I will continue to call him Teflon Roy because he's still above water, 45.0% to 40.7%. In April of 2020, right, that was sort of peak COVID. The world had just shut down. We didn't really know what was coming at us. His approval rating was at 72%. He's been underwater once or twice since then, but generally speaking, I mean, he has a higher approval rating than he does a disapproval rating.
I think it's a calculated decision to sort of keep his head down, not step too far out on the pointy end in some of those progressive causes that he might support in other ways, whether it's in donors or in, private events or in policy like what we saw on climate. And some of those things have kept him from, that progressive label sticking to him.
Yeah, it has. If you look at Trump 20 voters, 74% disapprove of what's going on, which means that there was 11% approving of Roy Cooper, as opposed to this right here with Joe Biden. There's 2% of Trump 20 voters that approve of what Joe Biden's doing, and there was the phenomenon of these Trump Cooper voters. Tim Boyum, who's on Spectrum News, doesn't live too far from me. He lives in the same part of Wake County as I do, and we marveled over the fact that in southern Wake County there were several households the way we have to drive home with Trump yard signs and Cooper yard signs, and those people exist. All right, we did favorability for several people, including Donald Trump. Can't do a job approval rating for him, but we can do a favorability rating for him. 52.2% of people have an unfavorable opinion. 42.9% have a favorable opinion of him. This breaks down about like you think it would. Democrats are absolutely, and self-described liberals are absolutely enraged. Republicans are generally supportive of them. Conservatives at 78%, liberals at 93%. So there's sort of an enthusiasm gap in the opposite direction when it comes to Donald Trump.
I think this will be important as if we look past 22, start looking to 24. Where are those folks who voted Republican, even straight ticket, voted everything Republican? Where were they on Trump's approval rating, which means that what are they going to be looking for in 2024 for a Republican candidate?
And this is what I'm about to say is purely political in nature. This is not a judgment of Donald Trump or Ted Budd or anything like that. But I do wonder when you take into account that they just had a rally with Donald Trump down in Wilmington, Ted Budd did. I don't know what that got him. I don't know what it did for him. When you look at 78% of conservatives say they have a favorable opinion. 93% of liberals say that they have an unfavorable rating. 76% of self-described moderates have an unfavorable rating. Unaffiliated voters, 68%, unfavorable, 37%, favorable. What votes did that get Ted Budd, tactically speaking, that he didn't already have?
Yeah, anybody who went to that rally was going to vote for him anyway.
Right. It's like preaching to the choir.
I think so, but maybe it mobilizes them, gets them to the poll, makes them feel better about their decision because again, to that social bias that they may be feeling, from neighbors and kids and whatever.
But love him or hate him, Donald Trump's a known quantity. I don't know who these people are, right? Everybody has an opinion, but who's never heard of him, right? Who is a likely voter in North Carolina who's never heard of Donald Trump? I don't know. I don't know who these people are, but he's a known quantity, right? There aren't people who are like, I don't know. Joe Biden's numbers are, oddly similar. 52.2% unfavorable for Trump, 54.5% unfavorable for Joe Biden, so an uptick. That 42.2% is almost the exact same. Again, people generally speaking have heard of him.
If you were looking at this as a business, somebody, an entrepreneur, you see a hole in the market as we move into 2024. There is a need for to draw in those people that aren't so polarizing, perhaps. and somebody who will have some of these, conservative fiscal policy values and some of those things that Republicans are seeking, those who really turn out, but maybe aren't such a lightning rod. So it'll be interesting to see what emerges after 22.
Yeah. Now we get into the secret sauce of what's going on in the Senate race. Ted Budd has a 1-to-1 basically image ratio. He's struggling with seniors and he's struggling with unaffiliated voters. Unaffiliated have a 42% unfavorable opinion. Seniors at 65 plus, 47% to 42% unfavorable. 74% of Republicans have only 74% of Republicans have a favorable opinion of him, which is not a good place to start when you consider that Democrats have an automatic registration advantage and have historically had a registration advantage. There are just, if every Republican went out to vote in a statewide race and every Democrat went out to vote in a statewide race, Republicans are losing if they voted party lines. And so there's 26% right here that Ted Budd's missing that he should have.
I really think that this goes straight to the national Democrats and, of course, Beasley's strategy of using the word extremist. I think that that word extremist is resonating with people who are a little bit afraid. They're afraid of being, ridiculed for supporting him, or they didn't like Trump, but they don't like Biden. I think that word extremist must have been pulled through the roof because they have been just pounding it, and I think it's working.
Just a little bit of good news, though. The people who said their election interest is at a 7, which was the highest rating that we had. Budd is up +5, 46 to 41%. Beasley, however, has a 12-plus favorability rating, 12-point plus favorability rating. She's doing well. There's very weak GOP opposition. Only 59% of Republicans have an unfavorable opinion of her. She's doing well. She's +11 with unaffiliated voters. She's doing well with seniors. What is that, +24 with seniors? She's in a much better image position. May not be that not many people know much about her, but she's doing a lot better overall with the public. And I think that explains a lot of the tightening of the polls. People really are upset with Donald Trump, or not with Donald Trump, but with Joe Biden and the state of the economy and all that. But they don't have as good of a feeling about Ted Budd maybe as they do Sherry Beasley.
Sure, but I think it's exactly what you said. They don't know enough about her. Her campaign's been very careful to make sure there is not a photograph with her and Janet Yellen or her and Joe Biden or Kamala Harris. They've been very careful to make sure that mailer opportunity didn't happen. And folks just don't know that much about her unless they have dug in and done some of the background checks.
Yep. All right, and if you look overall at what we did with favorability ratings, I mean, Sherry Beasley by far has the highest favorability if you just look at these blue lines here. The surprising part is that Donald Trump has the second highest favorability out of these 4 people. But again, he's a known quantity. Biden's just underwater, and I don't know what he does to get back out even in the next 2 years, because that's just such a big number. I don't know what you do.
I don't think you can come back from that. But this no opinion section is interesting to me. We see it the largest among Sherry Beasley, which goes back to our discussion that perhaps people don't know that much about her, and it's working in her favor.
Yep. All right, these are the heat maps. This is generally information that we already talked about, and all of our crosstabs again are available at johnlocke.org. You can click on the polls tab, and you can see all the information on our polls. Let's talk about the economy. Who feels good about it? Nobody. All right. It's about the same. We asked people, how likely do you think it is that there will be an economic recession during the next 12 months? 55.9% of people think it's likely. 28.6% of people think we're already in a recession. And 7.6% of people have their head in the sand and say that it is not likely. In fact, more people are unsure than say that it's not likely.
Right. Which it seems like that all the other slides that we've seen, the numbers should be further apart, not quite as close when you look at this one, because traditionally, people vote their pocketbook and they vote what's happening at the kitchen table and those things. But all the other slides we've seen are much tighter than this one, which means that this really does surprise me what we found this time.
It does. But you've got 84% of people right here who think that we're either going to have a recession in the next 12 months or we're already in one.
So then what are they worried? What is that driving thing? What is it that's going to get them to the polls to make a decision? If it's not this, what is it? Because we've seen all of these really tight polls.
Right. It's a great question. It's a great question. Then we asked, how difficult or easy do you find it to afford food right now? We asked this question a couple of months ago and wanted to see how it played out. 53% of people saying they're finding it more difficult to afford food right now, 22.9% saying they're finding it easy, 22.1% saying neither. That's actually a downtick, but that's still not a good sign when more than half of likely voters, politically engaged people, are finding it more difficult to afford food right now.
Sure, absolutely, and particularly when you're talking about unaffiliated and moderate, I kind of watch those because there's more unaffiliated in North Carolina than there is Republican or Democrat. So if they're approaching half, 45% of moderate, 52% of unaffiliated are saying difficult, then that's really remarkable, particularly when it's going across the education levels too. If you look at higher education and lower education, it's still within that middle range.
It is, and there is a difference that you're seeing. I mean, everybody says they're finding it more difficult right across the income categories, but 68% for people who make less than $50,000, 54% for making $50,000 to $100,000, and then it's still +8 in the $100,000 plus category.
People we're talking about food. We're not talking about vacations. We're talking about food.
Yeah,
that's a big deal.
The grocery bill.
Sure.
Yeah. Then we asked the same question about gas. How difficult or easy do you find it to afford gas right now? 56.5%, a little higher than food. So they're finding it more difficult to afford gas. That's even with gas prices going back down. But remember, that's 100% increase and then a 50% decrease from that. It's not, or a 50% decrease off the increase. It's not as low as it was before. And so people are still finding it difficult to afford gas. 20.2% say that it's easy, 21.3% say neither. And a lot of these same demographics still fit.
Sure. And in the urban area, it's 45 versus rural 69. And that's significant because, of course, rural drives further. I mean, that's the whole idea, right? Which tells you when we're making decisions about transportation, light rail, gas prices, environmental, electric buses, whatever, some of those decisions are being made by the folks who are in that 45% in urban areas, not the people who are almost 70% in rural areas. So this is really helpful for policymakers, too, when they go in and look at these numbers.
Yeah. All right, we asked the same thing about housing. How difficult or easy do you find it to afford housing right now? Lower than the other two numbers, but still that's a clear plurality, a near majority at 48.5%, saying that it's more difficult, 21.5% saying it's easy. These easy numbers are fairly consistent, 21.5, 20.2, 22.9. I mean, that's all within a 1.5 of each other, right? 23.5% say neither on housing. And again, people are just having a hard time overall, it feels like. Only seniors, the gap on seniors between difficult and easy on housing is probably the smallest, but that actually kind of makes sense. These are people that are more settled in their housing situations, much more settled than the other demographics.
They have a house already paid for. They may be in a different living situation. Highest being 63%, 18 to 34. My children fall in that category. And I know rent is a big issue. They're young, newly out of college, and that's a big problem because a lot of the jobs are not in rural areas where it's a little cheaper to live. They're in urban areas.
Yeah. All right, let's talk about elections, not the horse races and who's going to win, but how do you feel about the elections? We asked people, do you believe this year's elections in North Carolina will be free and fair? 57.8% said yes, which is actually an uptick from the last time we polled this question. 27.7% said no. That's still not a good number. That's still more than a quarter of people who say no. 14.4% are not sure. This breaks out on a partisan basis, about like you would expect it would. I mean, take a look at the Trump-Biden votes. 60% of Biden 20 voters said yes. 42% of Trump 20 voters said no, but that difference is just 5%.
Well, and the plurality, of course, most are saying yes. But not in the 70s and 80s, in the 50s and 60s.
Right.
And the no's are in the high 20s and 30s. This really speaks back to this issue of trust we're having across institutions. We've done a lot of coverage on CarolinaJournal.com that elections aren't alone, that there is failing trust across institutions. Military scores relatively high. Congress is very low. Journalism is very low. So I think we have a real deficit of trust in who's running our country, even in elections.
Yeah, we do, for a variety of reasons. Some of those are conspiracy theories, and some of those are legitimate questions, right? Like,
well, and social media feeds it, of course. We've talked a lot about that too.
It does, and I find it funny, this question of election integrity, right? If you're one of the people who and I'm not one of them, but if you're one of the people who think that Joe Biden did not legitimately win in 2020, then you're considered part of the big lie and you're crazy, right? But the people who call that the big lie, the media and establishment Democrats, act like they didn't sit there and drag a president through an entire impeachment process through a Russian collusion scandal that came from the Steele dossier that the Clinton campaign created. And so these two parties are just feeding on each other in different ways.
Or the opposition in 2016.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Resist. Hashtag resist. All right. Then we said, do you agree or disagree with the following statement? Every person that votes in person in North Carolina should present photo identification before voting. 62.6% of people agree with this statement. A majority, 53.4%, strongly agree with that statement. 25.7% disagree, 9.5% say neither, and 2.2% are unsure. This consistently polls in the mid to lower 60s. Has not changed in the past 5 years since I've been polling it. This is a popular policy in North Carolina.
And this is a higher rate than it passed. Is that correct? Do I remember correctly that in 2018 the vote was 51, 52, I think, percent? So it's actually, support has actually gone up since it passed as a constitutional amendment. I think this is really critical because Mitch Kokai has a great story about it. The Monday in Edenton, in the historic courthouse, they're going to be talking about North Carolina Supreme Court is going to be hearing arguments on voter ID, and the at issue is this is the case on whether or not voter ID is constitutional. Yeah.
Has anyone ever studied how many people do not have an ID? I mean, how do you live without an ID?
Sure. I think that there have been go ahead.
No, go ahead.
There have been studies on it, and I think that those data points aren't really making it into the arguments. In this case, we're hearing on Monday is the plaintiffs say that it's unconstitutional, that it's racist, and why it's important is because a lower court has already blocked voter ID in North Carolina. So if the North Carolina Supreme Court does not rule on this, it's over, regardless of what what North Carolinians passed in 2018 to institute voter ID, and regardless of what they believe today.
Yeah, and that's on the actual statute that the General Assembly passed, not on the constitutional amendment, which is a different question. The constitutional amendment court case has been remanded back to trial court, right? I'm looking at Mitch, who does all of our legal coverage for CJ, or most of it anyway. In my opinion, that's a massive politically tactical error, because all it's going to do, if they overthrow the voter ID constitutional amendment, which they are likely to, all it does is let Republicans put it back on the ballot and run it again for another 2 years, when 62.6% of voters support it. All right. How much of a problem is voter fraud in the United States? That is, votes being cast in the name of people who are not eligible to vote. Is it a major problem, a minor problem, or not a problem? 42.2% say it's a major problem. 24.5% say it's a minor problem. 24.6% say it's not a problem at all, and 8.7% are unsure.
It is interesting, but if you combine them, you're talking about whatever 66% or more say it's a problem, and
it's a problem.
That's that is really concerning, because it feeds into that mistrust that we were just talking about.
Mm-hmm. All right, this is a little bit different, but it has to do with a lawsuit that's actually about to make its way. Actually, it has made its way to the U.S. Supreme Court. Who gets to determine what a state's election laws look like? We're hearing more and more from D.C. that they think D.C. should have the power over it, but there's a lawsuit out of North Carolina talking about the independent state legislature, and that states' legislatures get to determine that. And in fact, if you read the Constitution, the plain language says that the states' legislatures determine the ways and means of state elections. And so we says, do you believe that laws regarding North Carolina's elections should be determined by the state legislature of North Carolina or the U.S. Congress? 53.1% of people stood up for federalism in this situation and said the state legislature. 24.7% said U.S. Congress, and 22.2% were unsure.
This is interesting to me. I actually thought it would be a little bit closer, because I'm seeing a lack of basic civics education in some of our public high schools, but this is encouraging that we did get that result.
It is. 41% of Democrats, to 37%, 41 to 37, which is right at the margin of error. Unaffiliated voters were much higher. on that, 26% difference saying state legislature. People understand that the elections need to be determined at a more local level, or
Well,
how we actually administer elections.
Sure. And the approval rating for Congress is extremely low. So that may be a we don't want to put it in their hands.
Right. All right. This is a different question altogether. Would you describe the type of government in the United States, or how would you describe the type of government in the United States? That's a typo on my part. Sorry. Would you say we have a democracy or a republic? I don't know whether to be heartened by these results or concerned about these results. I mean, there's no real statistical difference between people saying democracy or republic. 22.7% say neither. I don't actually know what that means. And then 13.6% of people are unsure. That concerns me a good deal. I think the left and the Democratic Party establishment has done a good job of throwing this word out an awful lot over the past 20 years, democracy, democracy, democracy. But when you stand up at school and you put your hand over your heart and you do the pledge to the flag, I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the democracy for which, no, that's not right, to the republic for which it stands. We set up a republic. We didn't set up a democracy. I'm fascinated by this and what people think government should look like.
Sure. I mean, it goes back to the civics education we were just talking about. And it's interesting to me that more Democrats thought it was a democracy, more Republicans thought it was a republic, and maybe that word looks familiar to me.
It's branding, right?
Yeah, it is. It's branding. And actually, this is important because we have a growing number, and we've been talking a lot about it. Brooke and I have been talking a lot about it with Carolina Journal, a growing number of folks who are native Spanish speakers. And sometimes they identify with the Democratic Party more often than the Republic because they like the word democracy and they associate it with democracy. And that's something that, it could be a language barrier or it could be just really good branding. But that is something that we've seen statistically with those native Spanish-speaking voters.
Yeah. All right. Now it's time for Q&A. I don't know if we have any questions from our online audience, but we'll also take questions from folks in here. Yes, ma'am.
Well, of the total that you polled, how many were Democrats, Republicans, others?
That's a great question. So we modeled it based off of what we think turnout's going to look like this year. I actually have that right here somewhere. Where'd it go? There it is, 35.3% Republican, 34.6% Democrat, 28.3% unaffiliated, and 8% said they were with another party. Other questions? Yeah, Jane.
Some people think that we should have a republic, but in actual fact we have a democracy. Could that be an interpretation?
It very well could be an interpretation. I like polling. I do a lot of it. I get a lot of job security about the fact that we do the poll here, right? But they're not perfect tools in that way, and because you have to ask a general question that people will answer. You don't keep them on the phone too long so they don't hang up and you don't have a complete survey. So that very well could be an interpretation. I don't know.
It could be cynicism, too, to what you're saying, those people who said, we have neither. Yeah, that may be they know the answer, but they don't believe that it's true.
We're supposed to have one, but...
Right.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Let me get AP here.
These results, especially for Biden and for Bud, Beasley, yeah, she's a little bit ahead. Do you think that's attributed to like the Roe v. Wade Dobbs kind of bounce? Because if it is, it's not a very big bounce.
I mean, some of it is. I think there was definitely a bounce over the summer from when we polled in June to when we polled in August. But then there's still just when the Federal Reserve is describing inflation, they use two terms. It is persistent and broad-based, and people are feeling that. I'm using those two words because people continue to feel that. We can talk about Dobbs all we want all day long. We can talk about Mar-a-Lago and what Trump may or may not have had at Mar-a-Lago all day long. But when my grocery bill is up, that's a problem. When I can't put food in front of my kids, that's a bigger problem to me than, whether the former president thought something was unclassified or not. And so I think that there's a swing and a miss on everybody's part by not talking about inflation.
I think that's exactly right. I think that there is a disconnect. It's not effectively landed with voters to associate inflation with Biden and, by extension, Beasley and Democrats across the ticket. And the favorability, we saw that widespread in favorability. People just don't know that much about Beasley, but they think they know Bud because of this extremist language and what we're seeing from their campaign.
Mm-hmm. Yes, sir.
Maybe in your next survey, I would like to see more questions as to what people feel about the media and what effect that has.
Sure.
On this.
We're liars.
I mean, a little bit, yeah. I mean, freedom of the press is for the birds, right?
Because, like the Trump rally, I really didn't see much coverage on it. And
Right.
I think, the media is suppressing it as much as they can. It used to be covered on Fox,
Sure.
the entire rally, but that's when he was running for president.
Right.
Yeah.
But anyway.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. We, when he was running for president, I covered the one that was at the farm out near Selma. And I think that was when the light came on in my head that he was going to win, because we were watching people try to climb 10-foot fences to get in because the line was so long, and backing up the parking lot 6 or 7 hours before the speech. But you're right. I think we're not seeing that kind of coverage, mostly probably because he's not running. But the candidates that he's endorsed are getting a lot of base support from it because they want that feeling of excitement, optimism, enthusiasm. And I think that they're sort of starving for it right now in this time of inflation. And that's why you're still getting those huge turnouts.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
On inflation, I'd like to say something I said about 8 of these ago, when inflation was a big deal for the first time. And the difficulty there is pinning it on somebody.
Yeah.
I would say the main reason for inflation is because of the large deficits, about $5 trillion over the last few years. But, taking out the ones that everybody voted for, there were 2 big ones during the last administration of big unnecessary spending, and one in Biden. So which one of it caused the inflation? It's a little hard to say inflation is because of this or that. And I heard Michael Walden say this a couple of days ago in whatever that program, Capital Tonight. He essentially agreed with me since I thought it.
Right.
So
Well, he called you the night before, right?
in other words, before the pandemic, we had huge in 17, 18, and 19, there were huge, big deficits in those years. And of course, the one at the beginning of Biden had no Republican support. But the last one in Trump's thing was, the very, very end, I think December of 2020.
Right.
Was huge. It was completely unnecessary. And so I think that's why inflation is not so easy.
Well, no, inflation is not easy, and that was one of our board members for the online audience, Skip Stam, who was saying that you can't really peg inflation on one thing or one person, and that's absolutely true. Our inflation problem, one, is absolutely global, and it's also not just government spending. It's not just the Federal Reserve printing more money. It's not just interest rates. I'm trying to put an analogy on it, but it's like my engine blowing out in my car and me adjusting interest rates is me like trying to change the oil. Like, okay, I have new oil, great. That's not going to change everything. We have supply chain issues. A lot of those problems are due to government overreach and government regulations. Regulatory capture is what people would call it in public choice economics, where we've kept people out and we don't have redundancies within the supply chain. The way that we do fuel versus grains is ridiculous in this country. The fact that we use more than 40% of soybeans instead of going into stomachs and into food products, is going into biodiesel. Which is sort of like taking a power strip and plugging it into itself and having infinite power, and that's not how it works. And so, yeah, you can't plug inflation on just any one thing. The thing is, I actually think that if Bud or Beasley, either one, wanted to just run away with this all of a sudden, they would say they have a plan and legislation that they would file in Congress to help combat inflation. The problem is Democrats aren't saying anything other than we're going to spend a lot of money, which is like trying to fight a wildfire with gasoline. And then Bud, had maybe a week of a very small spend on the grocery cart ad, and that's all he said about it. There's no actual plan. The problem with both political parties right now, they just want to use political power to punish the other party, but not actually, pass a budget or help me or you. Sorry, that's my soapbox right there. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Maybe a question or comment. Donna,
sure.
Talking about Governor Cooper, followed Lloyd for 30 years, 30
Sure.
plus years, and he has done a really good job. He and Morgan and Kim and all of them
Sure.
have done a really good job in keeping him out of the controversial issues.
Right.
And I think that part of that reason is for 24.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
I think, and I'd like to hear your comments.
Sure, sure.
I think he's on a very, very short list.
Right.
For either run for the against Tillis, but also depending on what
Absolutely.
Biden does, the popular Southern governor.
Absolutely, yeah. I completely agree, and I think nationally, he's he's really made that list. Washington Post talked about it. Lots of these organizations have. I will say that there was also some hesitation that maybe he didn't have enough personality, enough charisma, enough to carry him outside of the state. But you're right. I think keeping his head down, staying out of those super progressive things in public has definitely benefited him among North Carolina voters. The question is when you leave the state and he's now got to run with New York voters and California voters and Democrats across the state, will they like that sort of, middle of the road, milquetoast, not willing to, join the progressive causes? I don't know that would translate into it, but it might draw that middle unaffiliated voter that's looking for an alternative. I do think that's smart because he was Attorney General for 20 years with his eye on the executive mansion. Now he's in the executive mansion with his eye on something higher. But I do think that we're probably watching a really calculated approach to some of these really progressive issues. But don't let that fool you. I mean, he's in there. Whether he does it, out in public or in press releases or photo opportunities, he's still really engaged with the progressive wing of the party. He's, of course, head of the
keeps them in tow somehow.
Democratic Governors Association, donated money to fight nationally, to fight in favor of the more right-leaning candidates during the primary. So he is politically very astute.
He's the single most manicured politician I've ever seen. Mm-hmm. Absolutely he is. And close your ears, Skip. I would bet money, I'm not a betting man, but I would bet money, Hurricane Ian is coming up, and you will see him on TV.
Green shirt.
And he'll be in, nope, not green shirt. He's going to be in disaster black.
Yeah.
It will be black button-up shirt, black jeans. That's what he will wear. I would put $5 on it because they've looked through that, and that's what he wears every time there's a natural disaster. If there's something else going on, he wears the green, might have a jacket over it. He will show up in disaster black this weekend. AP.
Related to Cooper, though, there was a thing in, I think it was Politico back in February when they were first floating Cooper's name as a potential for 2024. They did a name recognition thing for him outside of the state. He had less than 10% name recognition outside of North Carolina.
Yeah, that's actually a great opportunity if you're a political consultant, right?
Right.
I get to craft it however I want it.
Right.
I saw other hands. Yes, sir.
A quick follow-up
Yeah.
or comment on what you're talking about with Bud, the rally in Wilmington. I agree. I don't think that was a smart move.
Mm-hmm.
And because the ones that were there were going to vote.
Mm-hmm.
And with Trump with all the controversy surrounding Trump right now,
Mm-hmm.
outside of the area vote for him, I think that probably occurred.
There's a lot of political science to this, but assuming that they are using sort of demographic modeling in the Bud campaign, and I don't know that they are, but assuming that they are, they're using a stagnant model or a static model and not a dynamic model, because that assumes to bring Donald Trump in September, if that was a calculated decision, and I don't know that it was, but if it was a calculated decision, it assumes that the population of North Carolina has not changed and it looked just like it did in 2020, and it doesn't.
In defense of that decision. We talked a little bit earlier about this desirability bias. There are a lot of folks in North Carolina, across the country, who like Donald Trump but are not going to answer a poll. They're not going to tell their neighbors. They're not going to tell their kids, their adult kids. And by going to this rally and showing it and showing people, lining up at 2 o'clock and streets blocked off with people trying to get in and head-to-toe Trump garb, it increases the acceptability of being a Trump supporter. And I think that may be one reason why they're like, get up on stage, look at the sea of people who are supporting him. You are not alone. And so while those people who showed up were going to vote for him anyway, people who saw it may have been on the fence.
And there is value in that. That's true. That's true. Last question right here.
North Carolina's one of the fastest growing states, new industry and all that. And you just alluded to something. Is anyone tracking voter registration of these newcomers?
We track voter registration, not necessarily of our newcomers, but we do track voter registration. I mentioned that website earlier, and this is a great plug. I appreciate that. If you want to go to carolinaelections.com, we have two sections of that website. One tracks early voting, and the other side, actually, we do weekly updates, right, Jim? Yes, thank you. We do weekly updates of county by county voter registration changes. And so you can see how your county or other counties or the state, generally speaking, are changing in voter demographics. If you want to look up that data, play around with it, feel free to do it. We are at 1 o'clock. I don't want to keep people any longer than they want. Don and I will still be here for questions. Thanks to our online audience. If we didn't get to your questions, I'm so sorry. We'll do another poll next month. We will release that on October 25th. We will not have, well, we might end up doing a live presentation here, but we will do also an evening event at the Jesse Helms Center that night. Brian Rogers, who's president of the Jesse Helms Center, will be the guest commentator down there. We'll let you know if we're going to do something here. But